I'm Ron Gallagher at Maximum Velocity Physical Therapy, and you're listening to HYPERSPEED Radio. You don't have to live in pain, whether you're running, swimming, playing a team sport, or just everyday fitness. We bridge a gap between medicine and strength and conditioning to help you break through at MVPT. What's up, everybody? This is HYPERSPEED Radio coming to you from Las Vegas, Nevada. And my name is Ron Gallagher. I'm at Maximum Velocity Physical Therapy. And this is our show. I'm stoked to have my my right-hand man, the super popular Derrick. He no longer is a student. He earned those PT letters, and he'd be quick to tell you that it's actually DPT.
That's right. I'm a doctor.
We call him Dr. Daddy.
Please don't call me that in the comments.
In the clinic, he's called Dr. Daddy because somebody needs to be in charge around there.
And apparently that's Dr. Daddy.
So a lot of people don't realize this, but Maximum Velocity started out specifically with the goal of becoming the Valley's most accomplished running specialty clinic. So Maximum Velocity, the stopwatch, all of that was basically geared towards capturing runners. And what I did to get my name out to runners was I offered the Las Vegas Triathlon Club a free in-service every month for a year. So I did a lot of in-services and was able to build a following of triathletes. Ironman myself, which you may or may not believe, but yes, I am an Ironman, 6-time half iron, 5-time open marathon, 25 plus half marathons, countless sprints and Olympics. Plus, I have coached tons and tons and tons and tons of age group athletes, and I even coached a youth elite triathlon club, which received the high performance designation, which means that the USA Triathlon believes that I could coach an Olympian. So we spend a lot of time talking about triathlon. And one of the reasons why I was super stoked to have Derrick want to work at the clinic is because he is a stud cyclist himself, and he shares a passion for endurance, and he has a dream of working with tons and tons and tons of cyclists, and we are trying to get that knowledge and experience out into the world. So Derrick's going to mostly present today. I have done nothing to prepare for this because I just want to be able to be here and be able to bounce some of this stuff off and let him take care of it. So without further ado, the cyclist, what do you call it? Guru. We like expert. Experts are better than gurus. But Derrick's going to take it over. Derrick, what you got for us today?
All right. So today's topic is all about gearing your bike for the best run possible. So that means how can you ride with the best efficiency so that you can preserve all that energy for your run?
I believe wholeheartedly that the number one predictor for performance in triathlon is your ability to run off the bike. And this is a run-oriented sport who does swimming and cycling. That's the way that I've coached. That's the way that I think the science and the data says. And I've spent my entire triathlon coaching career trying to help folks run off the bike. And there's a reason that no one's ever come out of the water first at Kona and won.
Right.
And there's very, very few who have finished the bike first and won.
Mm-hmm.
They needed more than a 15 or 20 minute buffer on the runners in order to hold them off and win the race. The best runners win in triathlon. And if this is your first triathlon, your ability to run is the predictor for how you're going to do in this race.
Right. Absolutely.
So running, in my mind, is the most important piece. Now, if you're, and the discussion that Derrick and I were having was, how does your performance on the bike influence your performance? And that's what we're going to talk about today.
For sure. And so there are so many triathletes, from low level to high level that don't really understand their bike metrics as they should. And this is like,
if this is your first round with triathlon and you just want to be able to go, a sprint distance, 12 miles, I think a lot of newbies are like kind of daunted, it's a daunting task to go that far on your bike.
Right.
But they don't really understand. So it's the details and the technology is really overwhelming.
For sure. And I think it's overwhelming, but it also, if you know how to use it, then that's when it really comes together.
Man, there's tons and tons of performance in just being able to understand some of these details. Unfortunately, and it's been my experience over time, it's really hard to teach the concepts that help you ride faster without being super sciencey.
For sure.
It's really hard not to be technology driven.
Yeah. And I think that part of that is true. And I think the other side of that is kind of dispelling the myth. Kind of like if you learn how to use certain things, then it becomes more innate. It doesn't become so, out of this bubble, out of the comfort zone.
Right. And I also think is really fun and interesting as a coach because the fitter you get or the better bike you get, the more the data changes. And so a fitness level compared to what gear you're in changes with time. So it's like a moving target.
Right. And I love to see, as a coach, how much you can grow to. We can see objectively all this data, and like if we were to chart it out and we can see that progression.
Right.
And then we say, hey, look, this is where you were like 6 months ago, and here's where you are now.
Right.
And the problem is that when people don't understand their bike metrics, then I feel like it becomes such a huge limiter on, their performance, their ability to prevent injury, and then it dips into that like efficiency and transfers into that running performance too.
Right.
So between swimming, cycling, and running, I'd say that cycling has the most metrics. I mean, with swim, like you got some feel. With run, you have some feel, but you do have some numbers. But by far, cycling has the most. And we're talking like power, heart rate, speed, feel, and cadence. Right. And with all those things, then now which numbers are you looking at?
Right.
So it's important that we understand if we can look at all these numbers and understand all these numbers, then we get to fine tune our training. We get to really hone in on how to make your fitness better and limit your fatigue. And I think that's kind of the beauty of it. And even if you only had, one or two of these numbers, you could still get by, but just the more you have, you can just really sharpen everything up.
Right.
So we're going to break these metrics down, make it a little bit easier to understand.
Woo. I was wondering where we were going first.
So we're starting with power. And power is the gold standard. It's by far the best measurement we have because it's just objective. It doesn't rely on the wind, headwind, tailwind. It doesn't matter about any of that stuff.
So let's talk about the anatomy of how we gather power.
Yeah. So power is basically how much force you push on the pedal. So how hard you push on the pedal and how fast you do it. So it involves the force and your cadence. So if you put those two together, then that's how you get your power value.
So there's a little device on the, how was the anatomy? So on the crank?
Yeah, so there's a couple different power meters. The most common one is usually on the crank itself, or it can be in your pedals, or it can be in the rear hub of your rear wheel.
Gotcha. And so for the newbies, this is a device that measures how hard you mash?
How hard you mash and how fast you do it.
Got it. So it's it can be tightly correlated to cadence.
Yes.
But it's basically measuring the force that you're putting into the bike.
Correct.
Why is that important?
Well, that's important because that means that even if you were riding in a headwind, even if you were riding uphill or downhill, you could make your training more consistent by still mashing either harder or lighter based on wherever you are, and that way your training would be more consistent.
Right. So I kind of think of power in the same way that we think about pace during running.
Mm-hmm.
Is that it fair?
Yeah, I'd say so.
So if you're at the track and let's say you're running 7:30s
Mm-hmm.
and you you can run a half marathon at 8:30, that's a really fast pace for you.
Mm-hmm.
And with a power meter on the bike, you might be overextending yourself with regard to power.
Right.
So that's a intensity. It's a measure of intensity.
Right. And you use it essentially during training. You can get really bang for your buck training. So you can use it for, your hill repeats. You can use it for your long, steady efforts. And then during that race,
Intervals.
Exactly. So then during the race, it becomes, that ability to pace perfectly. So
Right.
that you're not just waxed when you get off the bike.
Yeah, I think it must be said that really what this discussion boils down to, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, is how do we utilize the data from the bike to match the intensity that we train with,
Mm-hmm.
so that when you race, you're prepared for the load that you're providing yourself.
Yeah.
Because we talk a lot about in triathlon training as don't burn any matches. So the philosophy is if I have this book of matches that say on my swim or on my bike, and my intensity is more than what I'm trained for, then I burn a match.
Mm-hmm.
The more matches you burn, the more likely you are to say bonk or crash or whatever and not have your best performance.
Right.
What I'm saying, what I've been trying to say for a long time is if you train with the intensity that you race with,
Mm-hmm.
and you have the strength and you have the fundamentals to be able to tolerate that work level, when you race, you can do what you did in training, and it's not actually burning a match.
Right.
And that's how we get power numbers and speeds that we train for.
Right.
That's like setting up a person to have their best time or a PR.
For sure.
And at the end of the day, if we train to be in a place to burn those matches,
Right.
then it's not actually burning a match.
You're just prepared.
You're prepared.
Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely. And so the nice thing about a power meter is that it's instant. The moment that you put your foot down on that pedal, then it's going to respond right away. And that's great for your intervals because you can see exactly what you're doing and you can keep it consistent. So
Right.
it's like going to the gym and you put on the weights and you know exactly how many weights because you counted it all up.
Right.
And it stays that way for all your sets.
Right. So it's managing the intensity, and it reports to a device on your bike or your watch.
Right.
And yeah.
Yeah. I think the biggest limitation for power is that it is a little bit pricey compared to the other metrics.
Right.
The cheapest I've seen is probably around $300, and it's like an upwards of $1,500 or so.
Yeah. Can get real pricey.
Yeah, and
And if it's more expensive than your bike,
right,
you're probably not at a place where you need power.
exactly,
So I wouldn't say that power is an entry-level skill,
for sure.
but if you really want to dial in the intensity you should be riding with, probably power is the best way to do that.
Agreed, totally agree. And that kind of leads us into our next one, which is heart rate.
Heart rate.
Heart rate is usually the one that I'll recommend to our athletes who aren't ready to commit to a power meter. Like you said, it's just really pricey, and the heart rate monitor is like maybe $100 at most.
Right.
A couple of them that are a little more, a little less. But I like it because you can use it on the bike, and you can also use it for running too.
Right.
So now you have this additional metric that you can kind of carry over, and it's great because it allows you for that zone training to happen. But I would say that it's not as good as power in the sense that it has a little bit of a delay. So it's measuring the body's response to an effort, right?
Right.
You put an interval down, and then the heart rate shows up. So if you sprint, it won't show up during, but it'll show up after.
Right.
So it makes it harder for your high intensity intervals, but
Right.
it makes it really good for your steady state efforts.
There are definitely some limitations in heart rate.
For sure.
So from a injury physical therapist point of view,
Mm-hmm.
I find a lot of newbie triathletes trying to utilize heart rate are injured.
Yeah.
Because the intensities that they're trying to work through are challenging for their connective tissue.
Right.
So that means if you are trying to stay in zone 2 and that is making you run slower than your normal rhythm would be, then that usually hurts. So too slow, too soon in a person's beginning can actually be worse. And so using heart rate can help us with intensity, but it's definitely flawed in a way because it's so influenced by other things.
Right.
So, if you had coffee this morning,
Caffeine intake.
like if you had some of my nitro this morning,
Shout out to Royal.
then your heart rate's going to be jacked.
Yeah.
And if you didn't get any sleep, or if you got in a fight with your wife, or, there's all kinds of stress related reasons why.
For sure.
And then if you don't understand cardiac drift, what's cardiac drift?
I'm going to get to it in a little bit.
Oh, man. Okay. I'm not trying to put you on the spot today, though.
Yeah,
You're not a student today.
No. That's why I'm leading this podcast.
Right. I'll try not to take over.
And like you said, like some of the limitations are like the temperature change too. Here in Vegas, it gets hot.
Right.
And when it
That's
gets
a big
hot,
one.
it's going to spike up that heart rate too.
Right. So coffee, fight with your wife, 90, 98 degrees.
Yeah. Age.
And all of a sudden your heart rate's jacked. Is it because you're going too hard? Or is it just because that's where you're at physiologically?
Right. And that's what makes it so hard to compare to, like when you're looking at your ride from a year ago or last week even, like how much can you really track based on your fitness versus all these environmental factors too?
Right. So how do you use heart rate?
So I would say that heart rate is best used for those longer efforts. If you're going to do a zone 2, which we'll talk about zones in a little bit here, but if you did a zone 2, like an endurance ride for a while, then the heart rate would be pretty steady, or it should be pretty steady.
Right.
Where it falters is when you start to add in those surges or attacks or intervals.
Right. Well, I can't wait to get to the zones because I think people think they have a clear understanding of them, and the details of it seems very straightforward, but there's usually some nuances there that are kind of hidden. So can't wait to get to that.
All right. Well, let's get to it. Next slide,
please.
Let's
do it. All right.
All right.
So I know you have a lot to say about this.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important that a strength base precedes your aerobic base. So some of the limitations with some of this stuff is actually because of a strength base limitation.
100%.
So we'll get to that, I'm sure.
So basically, if we look at this, it's a 7-zone model, and it's made as a percentage of your maximum heart rate or your FTP, which FTP is functional threshold power, which is theoretically how much you can hold for an hour. So if we break this down, we're looking at zone 1 being your active recovery where you're spinning it out. Zone 2 and zone 3 is more of your endurance pace. So this is where most of our triathletes will be for their distance.
You'd hope.
Zone 4 is that FTP, that 100% that you can do for about an hour.
What's FTP?
So that's the functional threshold power, where you can hold it for an hour.
Why is that important?
It's important because it's kind of like doing a 1 rep max test for weightlifting. It shows you kind of your benchmark. That's everything that you compare to so that you can train properly and efficiently and not get yourself hurt.
So again, when we're trying to determine intensity, we like just like in lifting, we need to know sort of in the ballpark what your 1 rep max is so that we can properly give you some strength to provide a stimulus that's going to make it change.
Right.
The FTP is the heart's version of that, the cycling version of that.
Right. Absolutely. And then your zone 5 or your VO2 max, which would be more of your 3 to 5 minute max power. Zone 6 is your anaerobic, so that's looking at your 1 minute max power. And then zone 7, which is your neuromuscular, would be your 5 to 10 second sprint.
Yeah.
So all of these play a role in what type of training you'll do, because you want to hit these zones when you're doing intervals or hill repeats or, a straight up endurance ride. And on the far right, we have RPE, which is the rate of perceived exertion. And this basically is just a subjective description of how these would feel, kind of a ballpark.
Right. In case you didn't have a heart rate monitor or a power meter, you can use these, relatively speaking.
Relatively, yeah. but I would not rely on them because how you feel just varies so much.
Yep.
And we'll get to that too.
I think is with this up, I think it's important to note that if you're easy on your easy days and hard on your hard days, and you're never in the middle, that's usually the best way to train and the best way to race, and that's how you show up ready to have your best race.
100%. And we actually call that a polarized approach. So when it comes to that training, you want your easy days to be easy, and then you want that hard to be as hard as you can so that when you're racing, you're right on the money.
And if you train that hard, it's available on race day.
Exactly. All right. So now let's talk about speed. So
I love speed.
I love speed until it comes to cycling.
What does that mean?
So I like speed as a number that I look at after I'm done with the ride.
Right?
I don't like looking at speed during the ride so much because I think that it can kind of mess with your head.
Yeah.
Speed is what I call the cheapest objective measurement. So
if you're coming down the hill at Red Rock and you're like 40 miles per hour, you don't want to look at your watch and...
No, because I know that means that I have to go back up at like 5 miles an hour.
Yeah, that's a fact.
So there's just so much that affects speed, like a headwind, a tailwind, going uphill and downhill. And I think that in theory, if you did the same road, let's say you did the same road every time and the weather conditions were the same every time, then you could probably train with speed. You could gradually see over time that you're getting faster.
Right.
But there's just a lot of environmental factors in the same way that heart rate does, where it could kind of mess with you where are you getting faster, are you not? So I think there's a little bit more nuance to it, but it is doable.
Right. Which kind of makes me think of like Strava can convert your pace to grade adjusted pace.
Right.
So grade adjusted pace sometimes is more important than your actual pace.
Right. Absolutely. And, I think that oftentimes when you're beginning, you just see the numbers and you're like, ooh, I just went down at like 50 miles an hour. And that's like really cool.
Right.
But like, did you have a tailwind?
Right. Or like a pitch like this. Yeah. So it doesn't necessarily mean that your skill is moving the bike that fast.
Right. But definitely is doable and it's much cheaper. So I'll put it as an option.
For sure.
The next one that I want to talk about is feel. I hate feel. I mean,
feel is definitely an advanced skill.
Yes. I think that pros have they're very in tune with themselves and how they feel on the bike and the swim and the run. And that's what really sets them apart from, your average rider. And of course, it's the cheapest, but it also is very subjective.
Right.
And I think if you're just starting out, it's hard to have a reference point of what is zone 7, what is zone 5. But if you've been training with power for so long, then there's no reason why you can't, acquire that feel. But I don't think it's easy to start with, though. It's very much an acquired skill.
Right. Definitely experience related.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And so, there's no objective measure here with feel. So it would be like going to the gym and you just go, I feel like lifting heavy today. And then you just keep throwing on weights till it's heavy.
Right.
But how do you know that last week you didn't go heavier or the next week that you won't go lighter?
Right.
So we want to have some consistency.
And not all athletes can be super honest with themselves often enough to be able to use that for any consistent period of time.
Oh, totally agree. I think that, we always want to make ourselves feel a lot bigger, right? So we're like, oh, that was easy. That was nothing.
I don't feel like attacking on that hill today. Like it's just not in the cards today.
Right.
Yeah.
So the next thing I want to talk about is cadence.
Yes. I happen to think that cadence is a huge deal.
Absolutely. It is the one that ties it all together. I mean, everything from speed to power has cadence involved.
Right. And we can even look at cadence data in injured cyclists because injured triathletes because it's the glue that holds all the intensities together.
Right. Absolutely. And I think...
What is cadence?
So cadence is basically how fast your feet are moving per minute. So revolutions per minute as you're pedaling.
Okay. And what would you consider a normal cadence to be?
Normal is relative, but I will say that if we were to give an optimal cadence, that bell curve would sit around 90 to 95 revolutions per minute.
Right. So it's different for everybody.
Yes.
And it's definitely experience related.
Mm-hmm.
So if today is your first bike ride,
Yeah.
your cadence is not likely going to be around 90, 95.
No, it'll be a little bit lower.
But if you are training in a way that is emphasizing cadence from the get-go, I think the learning curve on how to use your bike is going to be less and less.
For sure.
Because
Definitely.
cadence will help you reach all the numbers you want to reach.
Right. And I think that 90 to 95 number basically comes from that sweet spot between your muscular fitness and your cardiovascular fitness.
Oh, the serotonin.
Are you sure it's not the coffee?
So for running, that's what the runner's high is.
Yeah.
Is your brain is moving at a particular
like rhythm?
Yeah, rhythm, but Hertz measures I can't think of the it's a physics buzzword. But that rhythm is what brings on the runner's high.
Yeah.
And there's a running cadence associated with that, and that's 180, 185. And being able to produce that speed is a sweet spot for your brain and your muscles and your nervous system. In fact, a lot of this has to do with a nervous system that's too slow. This might be a curveball for you. Again, not trying to put you on the spot, but what's neuromuscular fatigue?
So neuromuscular fatigue is basically that communication between your brain and your muscle. And it needs to have that ability to produce that power, right? It's that force over speed.
Right.
So if it doesn't have that snap to it, then it's just going to kind of get slower and slower over time and create this huge delay.
And if you took somebody on as a cycling client and they have a 60 RPM cadence on their bike, a lot of the changes that have to happen are neuromuscular.
Right.
To be able to convert 60 to 90, which is a big jump.
It is.
And if there's more than a jump than what you're prepared for, then your neuromuscular system actually kicks back.
Right.
And you get this really, really strange fatigue, and you can't really put your finger on it because it doesn't feel like anything else. It doesn't feel like muscular fatigue. It doesn't feel like I need to take a nap.
Right.
It's a really, really like soft fatigue, and that's your nervous system actually learning how to fire faster.
Right.
And there's not enough coaches or athletes who understand neuromuscular fatigue because it happens in running too.
Right.
And we need 2 to 3 weeks of a slight increase in cadence to be able to catch our nervous system up permanently. If you try to change the cadence too fast, too soon, it's more than the neuromuscular system can handle, and you actually don't make any permanent changes.
Right.
So with regard to cadence, understanding neuromuscular fatigue is kind of a big deal.
For sure. And I think this is where strength training plays a huge role in this too.
Boom. Bring it back. Full circle.
Exactly. And, strength training, we see a lot of neuromuscular changes in the first couple of weeks.
Right.
Even though we have long-term strength changes, those neuromuscular changes happen so fast, and it carries over so well to every sport, not just cycling.
The nervous system that is firing when you're lifting is the same system that's firing when you're cycling.
Right.
So in my mind, the cycling and the strength training are intimately related, and an injured cyclist will not be able to produce in the weight room. It's across the table, a really, really big feather in the triathlete cyclist hat to be able to be strong enough to be able to produce the neuromuscular changes on the bike.
Right. And to your credit, like you were saying, if you train with it, then you'll be able to perform with it.
Right.
So that's why zone training really starts in the weight room. It doesn't start on the bike. You want to create that solid foundation so that your neuromuscular system is ready to handle the zones.
And that's the strength base for the aerobic base, because if you're it's like a car.
Right.
If your engine doesn't have a chassis to push against, then the two things can't ping off of each other.
Right.
And so your strength base is really like the shocks or the chassis of the car. How much force can the engine produce and the muscles and bones be able to work against it to produce speed and power.
Right. And I think this is such a key point that gets lost in the endurance world because,
For sure.
everyone's like, oh, I have to swim, I have to ride, I have to run. Like, I don't have time to add another thing to this.
Right.
But what they don't understand is that it's going to take everything to the next level while keeping you injury free.
For sure.
So,
as long as it's executed well,
right.
which is really what we talk about an inordinate amount of time, because it is about stabilizing, it is about proximal more than distal,
Right.
and it is about heavy, but it's appropriately heavy. So we're not just willy-nilly loading people. It's a progression of force.
Oh, absolutely. And we have this saying in PT, which is proximal stability enables distal mobility.
Right.
And so what that means is that if we can, give all of that strength and all of that neuromuscular adaptation to the closer segments of your body, so your back, your legs, your shoulders, then there's no reason why what you're pushing off of when you run, when you swim, when you ride is going to be the best that it can be.
Right. So talk about the relationship between cadence and power.
So cadence and power. So power, once again, is the amount that you're mashing your pedals and how fast you're pedaling. So if your cadence is higher, so if you're pedaling faster, then the amount that you have to mash can be lower. Comparatively, on the other side, if you're pedaling really slow, then you have to push a lot harder in order to have the same power.
Right. And so we named this discussion gearing.
Right.
So let's talk about how the cog in the front, the cog in the back, relates to cadence, and then how those two things relate to power.
Yeah. So
unless I'm getting ahead of myself.
No, you're right on the money.
All right. I really didn't prepare for this at all.
This is not new. So if you think about a bike, you have gears in the front, gears in the back. The gears in the front, you normally have around 1, 2, or 3. The average would be 3 or 2. And I would say that the bigger the chainring in the front has a certain number of teeth on it. And the more teeth that are on it, that means the harder it'll be to push. So the more torque that you can get out of the bike.
Right. So when you say more torque, that actually means
like more force.
More force and
more power.
Faster.
Yeah. But you have to have the strength to utilize that.
Right.
Oftentimes for a beginner cyclist or a triathlete, if the gear is too big, then they'll be pushing so slow that they can never bring their cadence up.
Right.
And then the gears in the back are kind of the opposite. So the smaller teeth in the back basically represent a harder gear, and then the gears in the with more teeth in the back represent those that would be easier to spin when you're going uphill, for example.
Right.
So if you use these two together, the front and the back gears, you're looking for that 90 to 95 RPM, right? That cadence that feels so comfortable, that runner's high, that cycling high, that would feel very efficient.
Right. So if I hear you correctly, the big rings in the front are generally where my bike should be. The little guys in the back fine tune where I should be.
Right.
And I should be able to, regardless if I'm going up or going down, I should be able to keep that cadence around 90. And if the resistance in the bike is keeping me consistent at 90, then I'm getting the most out of my bike.
Yes, 100%.
Woo!
Yes. You will be the most efficient if you can stay within that realm. So now it's just a matter of balancing it, no matter if you're going, uphill or downhill or headwind or tailwind.
Right.
If you can balance everything, then you will optimize that efficiency.
Right. And I think that those three balancing acts that come together for one balancing act is where cyclists get lost. So if I'm going up, talk about where my gearing should be, what my cadence should be, what my power will be like.
Yeah. So I don't think there's a straight answer for this, but I would say that...
Right, which is the cool part of cycling.
Absolutely.
Because you're a good cyclist, and I could use a lot of work. And if your gear ratio is going to be one thing. I can't reproduce that,
Right.
but we both can change over time.
Yes.
That's the fun part about coaching cycling.
Yes. So let's talk about hills that are, let's say, less than 5% grade.
Okay,
So,
so
like a steady uphill.
That's not a big,
Not very steep.
not very steep. Got it.
So in general, I would say that you could, depending on your strength, of course, stay kind of in that big ring in the front, meaning that you can push a little harder, and then you can fine tune the back so that you can really get that 90 RPM. And for the most part, it's more efficient to stay seated when you're climbing because you're not slowing down your cadence so much, so you can kind of keep that 90 to 95 RPM.
Right. It offers less muscular fatigue.
Yes. And those are the things that you want to preserve during that run too.
For sure. When should you stand up?
I would stand up beyond 5%. I'd say like a 7 to 10% climb if it's really steep and punchy.
And the whole climb?
And depends on the length of the climb, I'd say. But if the climb is less than, I don't know, let's say about a quarter mile, then I would definitely get out of the saddle and just punch it over because so many triathletes, they'll just stay in the saddle and they'll stay in their arrow position.
Right.
And that just drives me nuts because you don't want to be bent over and, in the small position when the aerodynamics don't really matter.
Actually bleeding power at that moment.
Right. So you're better off giving a little surge of power so that you can get over the climb and then get back in your arrow position.
Right. And talk to me about when you do stand up, what's your rhythm supposed to be like?
So it's going to be very hard to maintain 90 to 95 RPM when you're out of the saddle.
Right.
So naturally that cadence is going to drop, and that's okay. That's when it's considered, okay to do because you're doing it for a very short time.
Right.
And so with the rhythm of it, you want to essentially rock the bike opposite of the way that you're pushing down. So if my leg is pushing down, then I want my bike to rock to the opposite side.
Right.
So you find this rhythm, and it almost kind of ends up like a dance.
Right.
And you're trying to keep everything with your core and your back and your body stable.
Right.
Because you don't want to bleed that power into your body flopping around. You want it all go into the bike.
It's not a big lean.
Right.
And essentially what you're doing is you're kind of creating a torque on the carbon of the bike or the aluminum of the bike, and you're using the bike as a lever to push off of. Right. So that you can get up there as fast as possible.
Yes. And I think a lot of triathletes need to practice this skill because with the position on a tri bike, everyone's so leaned forward that they're not comfortable standing up.
Right.
And I know so many high-level triathletes who refuse to stand up. They just don't want to. Right. Because they don't feel comfortable in it. But like with everything else, if you do it during training, there's no reason why you can't pull it out for a race.
Does that influence their run?
Yes, 100%.
How so?
Because they're bleeding more energy and more power when they're staying seated for that climb.
Totally. And also, you can get stuck in this one position, this repetitive one position in that arrow slot, and only use your muscle fibers in that particular slot.
Right.
Having a chance to stand up and push alters the muscle fibers that we're using, and it allows for a diversification of the force through the person's body.
Right.
And that helps preserve energy. It's actually recovering to stand up and push.
Right.
But we don't think about it that way.
Right.
We think the aerodynamics are still happening, but at that particular grade, there's no aerodynamics.
Right. Totally agree. And I think if more athletes were to stand up and punch those, steep climbs, then they would be seeing better times automatically.
Because for every climb, there's a
descent.
Let's talk about the descent. I mean, if you reach the top with more pace, you're probably going to get to descend a little better.
Yes.
So let's talk about how we descend and what the gear, cadence, power, all that should be like.
Yeah. So one of the biggest skills that I learned from cycling was when you crest a climb, don't just stop pedaling. Everyone wants to just take a break as soon as they get to that top of that hill. But the trick is actually to keep pedaling that same power until you start going downhill. Once you start going downhill, then you can kind of relax a little bit more. But if you're at the very top, don't just stop because that's where you lose that momentum.
Right.
So carry that momentum into the downhill.
I made it. Let me take a second.
Right. That's the
a
trap. We didn't plan that.
We did not plan that. So the trap is to stop your legs from moving and carry the momentum of the climb through the top of the apex of the hill.
Right.
You got to carry that momentum through.
Absolutely.
And for somebody like me who has a little bit more mass, I know that I'm going to be able to descend better. So it's easy for me to say, okay, when I get to 10 feet from the top of this hill and I know I'm just going to roll over the top, I'm just going to start my break then. And it's a total trap.
Yeah.
Total trap, because I'm losing the momentum of those 10 to 20 feet.
Right.
And I can't roll into this descent as well as I possibly could.
Right. And I always tell my athletes that 10 to 20 feet right there is the most important part of the climb.
For sure.
It had nothing to do with the climb before that. It's that very top that matters the most.
For sure. We're trying to preserve momentum
Right.
moving forward.
Yep. And so, your cadence when you're going downhill, it's going to be harder to hold that 90 to 95. Right. You're just going to start spinning out. So that's when you start shifting your gears so that the resistance gets harder.
Right. So in the front, it gets bigger.
Yep. So you go to your big ring, and in the back, you get smaller. So you're going to your smaller rings.
Which is what traps newbies. It is just a funny phenomenon happening in the bike.
Yeah. It's just, their want to just keep spinning. And then once they get into those heavier gears, they just want to stay there.
Should you still feel something in your chain?
Yes. You should still feel the resistance giving back to you, but now you should be able to kind of push through and feel yourself getting a new rhythm.
It's going to be a little teeny tiny bit of resistance, and it's going to be excelling your bike.
Yes.
Which makes it scary because your pace is going to
Increase.
Dramatically change.
Right.
But really what you're trying to do is get that cadence back to a normal 90 as fast as possible.
Yeah.
And then try to overcome the strength loss from the climb.
Right.
And try to help all that balance out.
Yeah. And naturally during the descent, you'll get that recovery too, because you won't be pedaling constantly. You'll have to slow down for your turns and your, corners and whatnot too.
Not the time to coast.
Right. That's actually the time to push through.
And I also feel like if you're afraid to descend fast and you're also the coaster, you're at risk to crash
The most.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the momentum of the bike is more side to side than it is moving forward.
Yes.
And if you just roll through that descent, you're just going to get it over with faster.
Right. And it reminds me of an old person on an e-bike and how much power that they have under them, and they don't have the ability to control it, and that's what makes them more likely to crash.
Right. And if you do hit a rock or a crack or some sort of debris,
Right.
and you are coasting, it'll shove the bike side to side.
Yep.
More so than if you're just rolling as well as you can forward.
Exactly. I think that a lot of newer triathletes don't understand that speed is actually what's going to prevent you from crashing.
Right.
Which sounds counterintuitive.
Totally.
But the slower you go, now you have all this side to side.
I'm correlating the speed with how much it's going to hurt.
Right.
And not that my ability to be up on my bike is better if I'm going faster.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that kind of takes me into how to be efficient.
Aha.
The bread and butter of this whole thing.
Yes. Efficiency.
So I boiled this down to 3 points. I said consistency, body position, and knowing your route. So let's start with knowing your route because we've been kind of talking about this. Mm-hmm. But if you scout your routes, if you know where all the twists and turns are, where all the pinch points are, where all the U-turns are, then you know where you can push. You know how to take your corners.
Right.
And like we're talking about, that's how you carry that momentum and that speed as you're going downhill.
Right.
If you know what's coming, you're not so afraid. But if you just don't even know and you're just shooting in the dark, then yeah, it's going to be really scary.
Right. For newbies who are racing and understanding your bike course, the Athlete's Guide can help you. Pre-writing the course can help you. Mm-hmm. And then talking to other people who have done the race will help you. And usually in our valley, there's something that can reproduce it. Mm-hmm. Somewhere where we can practice the skill of whatever that race is going to be.
Right.
And I would lean on your fellow triathletes or coach to help you with that.
For sure. I think the more information that you can acquire about the course, the better off you'll be because you know what to expect. The other point I have on here is consistency. So let's talk about cardiac drift.
Cardiac drift. So sneaky.
So cardiac drift is the quintessential point for endurance athletes.
Right.
And so if you did a zone 2 run, so let's say you did an endurance run or endurance ride, and you look at your heart rate afterwards. So your effort was pretty steady, but you look at your heart rate afterwards and you started at like, let's say 130 beats per minute and you ended at like 180. That's a huge jump.
Right.
And you don't want that kind of jump because what it shows is that your body just worked a lot harder in order to get to that finishing point.
Right.
Where you want it to be more consistent.
Right.
So I would say an acceptable cardiac drift would be more like, 5 beats per minute, but not like 10 plus.
Right. Closer you get to max heart rate, the bigger problems you get.
Right. And you'll lose so much energy for your run, especially if you're just burning yourself off during the ride.
Right. And all of the factors that we talked about before that influence heart rate also dramatically influence cardiac drift.
Right.
So your stress, caffeine, nutrition, heat, intensity, sleep,
Yeah.
all of those things influence cardiac drift.
Absolutely.
And we're just looking for a flatter increase over the effort and not such a dramatic change over the effort.
Right. And this kind of ties in with power too. So can I pull up that graphic, Austin? So I made this very beautiful graphic on Microsoft Paint. Shout out to Paint.
Woo!
And I call this the red line. So the red line represents...
You need to trademark that, dude.
It might already be somewhere. So the red line represents the optimal power that you can hold for your given distance. So let's say this is a half Ironman course, right? 56 miles. That power is what you want to be holding as consistent as possible for the whole thing. What the green line represents is what you will be probably doing in reality, which is the ebbs and flows of the course. You're going to have, a little bit over, a little bit under. Sometimes you'll be, a little bit off. And the thing that separates the pros from the amateurs is that they are as close as can be to that red line. They know when they can push over it for race strategy, or they know when to back off of it, when they're taking corners or whatnot. But the closer you can get to that red line is the better that you can be and more efficient that you can be to save energy for the run.
Yeah, that's a really great way to look at it. The distance between the white space between the green line and the red line is what you're trying to minimize.
Yes.
And being at that level during training and understanding how you're training is usually where that comfort comes from.
Right.
And your ability to be at that place happens in training.
Right.
And what I find is usually too hard or far too easy, and the space above the line and the white space below the line is too much.
Yes.
And then when they race, they don't have that consistency, and then the efforts get away from them and they crash and burn.
Yes.
And because the run is the hardest physiologically on us, it exposes your training error.
Yeah, absolutely. And this kind of brings us back to the matchbook analogy that you were talking about. So
yeah, ask the Norwegians about this approach. They're out there killing it because they're doing this work capacity.
Right. And they have a really good understanding of what it means to prepare your body for the event.
Right.
So they're training close to that red line so that they can perform at that red line.
Right. Which if you talk to the average professional, that's crazy. Mm-hmm. Because traditionally in the 80s and 90s, we didn't do that.
Right.
And the more we learn about this particular style of training, the more and more commonplace this is going to be. Strength-based to support an aerobic base.
Right.
A training style that caters to a racing style that's all consistent with how your efforts are and your intensity is during training.
Right. And so the last thing that I have for efficiency was body position. And this kind of ties in with the equipment too, but if you can train in that small reduced frontal area, really tucked in, and you train with your disc wheel, you train with everything that you would when you're racing, then there's no reason why you can't race with it.
Totally. The guys from oh man, what's my disc? Flow. So I love those guys from Flow. Local Las Vegas guys doing amazing things in cycling. They'll tell you that riding with that disc consistently is the key to being safe when the winds change. And actually that crosswind isn't as dangerous if you train with your disc.
Right.
So for the newbies out there who want to run a disc, if you know that your race can run a disc, right? Because like Kona, you can't use a disc. Other races, you can't use a disc.
Right.
But if you know you're going to use your disc, then you need to run your disc all the time.
For sure. And even deeper wheels. It doesn't have to be a disc, right? Like, I think there are people who...
What are deeper wheels?
So we're talking about the depth of the wheel itself. So if you looked at it from the side, you would see either a really shallow rim or you'd see a really deep rim. And the deeper it gets...
They have numbers?
Yes. So I would say shallow is more like your 20 to 30 millimeters, whereas your deeper ones are more like your 60, 80, and beyond.
Right, because it goes up to 90.
Right.
So a 90 depth is not quite disc, but definitely not shallow.
Right. And that will feel a whole lot different in windy conditions and even not, right? You will move faster with a deeper wheel because it's more aerodynamic.
Right.
So you can cut through.
So it improves your front to back pace and you sort of cut through the air.
Right.
Which for the newbie feels very fast and very specific with the direction your bike is going.
Yeah.
But it's actually safer.
It is safer. But, you know, it feels scary, but that's why you got to train on it.
Right. And the more you train on it and the more efficient you get, the stronger you are, the more experience you get, the faster and the faster and the faster that thing goes.
Right. I can't tell you how many times I've heard cyclists and triathletes will say, oh yeah, I'm training on my training wheels and I'll race on my race wheels.
Right.
And I'm like, why don't you just train on your race wheels?
Mistake. Yep.
If you train on your race wheels, you know how it's going to perform.
Totally.
But there seems to be this discrepancy.
Totally. And what are the chances they're running the same cartridge in the back?
Oh, it's usually not even the same.
So you don't understand your intensity.
Right. So it's totally off, and it needs to be what you're training for. It's race specificity.
For newbies, that means there's a certain amount of teeth on the back, and those teeth influence your cadence in your power, your performance, your intensity, how you feel getting off the bike.
Right. So you lose that efficiency if your cassettes aren't the same between your wheels, first of all.
Right.
And then the wheel itself should be the same as what you're going to race on.
Right. What about chain lube?
So there's been a little shakeup for the world of chain lube.
Woo! This white chain is dope.
Yeah. And, you know, there's a lot of companies that will say how this chain lube is going to be the best. It's going to minimize the friction so you can be fast as possible. But what it really boils down to, I'd say, is chain lube and then there's chain wax. And basically, if you use one or the other, it doesn't really matter, but you just need to be consistent in cleaning it and reapplying that lubricant.
Right.
So, you know.
Which influences cadence, which influences power, which influences your performance.
Right.
So there is a correlation between your chain health and your performance and getting off your bike ready to run.
Yes. So bike maintenance is another podcast coming. But
I thought he was going to build in a bike fit comment too, because that's probably coming too.
Oh, that's coming.
That's coming.
So let's talk about T2. Transition 2.
Woo!
Transition 2 is
Giraffe
the transition from bike to run. And these tips from here are going to be all of the non-training fitness tips, but equally important because it gives you that smooth transition so that you're ready to run. You're in the mode, you're locked in.
Right.
So one of the biggest things I like to give is to practice a flying dismount. I think that there is a smoothness to be had when you can basically get off the bike while it's still moving and then run alongside it.
Right. Which is an advanced skill if you're really, really concerned about time. new triathletes, we don't necessarily need to work on flying dismounts, but as your competitive place in the race heats up, so does the time for T2.
Yes.
Right? So these elite draft legal races, they're going to spend between 20 and 30 seconds in T2.
20 to 30 seconds.
That's insane. So what that means is there's a dismount line. You're off the bike. You're riding your bike as close as you can to that dismount line. You're off the bike in a legal way. You run your bike to your spot, slip your shoes on, and you're out of transition.
Yep.
That's the fastest way to do it. If your cycling efficiency was not optimum, then the baby giraffe legs coming out of T2 is really a big limiting factor for your ability to run a good run split.
Absolutely. And the other note that I have here is to fuel before you enter T2. So if you can fuel and get all of your nutrition set up before you enter transition, you don't have to worry about it in the first couple miles of the run.
Right.
You can just worry about settling in and getting your rhythm.
Right. So again, that comes back to training.
Yep.
And if you're training your cycling in a way that you can use your hands to be able to eat or drink, that's one thing. And then number two, we're trying to convert this neuromuscular control of cycling to neuromuscular control of running. They're very separate systems.
Right.
So practicing changing systems is really important. And if you're out of fuel, it's going to be real hard to do that.
Oh, yeah.
So you're going to have some cramping or some spasming or shaking as a result of probably sugar.
Right.
Probably sugar.
For sure. And then one of the things that I like to offer to new triathletes too is using elastic laces for their shoes.
Right.
So basically these are essentially an elastic that you can replace your laces with. So you can put it on any shoe and it allows you to just slip your foot in and you just cinch the elastic and then off you go.
Off you go. No crossover.
Bunny
and big
ears.
Yeah. None of that. You ain't got time for that. We're in a race.
Exactly. You're racing. So 20 to 30 seconds and you want to be out. So it's one of the best things and it's easy. It's really cheap. I mean, I think I picked them up for like $8.
Right.
So it's something that you can do and practice with too.
Right.
And all of these things you have to practice, in training. You cannot just start this off during the race.
Live transition practice is super important.
Yeah.
So you're finishing your bike. Maybe you do a short bike, long run or long bike, short run, but your transition should just about always be live.
Yes. And I don't think enough triathletes practice this.
That's a fact.
Because they're all about fitness.
Because it hurts.
Yeah.
Because it sucks.
Right.
Yeah.
And they're like, I'm not in a race. I don't have to
put in that work. So the more consistently you can convert cycling nervous system to running nervous system, the faster that's going to be and the easier you're going to get on to running fast.
And the better it'll feel.
Totally.
I mean, if you're just waxed from the bike and you try to convert that into a good run, it's going to be an uphill battle for you.
Totally.
The last thing I put on here is don't take your helmet off until after you rack your bike. So a lot of triathlons have this rule where if you take your helmet off before you rack, you're DQ'd. You're out.
Sure.
So,
sure.
Don't lose that.
In youth triathlon, it's an immediate penalty.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really, really big deal. If your hands are on the bike, you have the intent to ride. If you have the intent to ride, your helmet needs to be buckled.
Right.
So bike racks, then your buckle comes off and your helmet comes off.
Right. Absolutely.
Protect that dome, yo.
All right. And time for our final slide, please, Austin.
Boom.
Okay. So if you would like more help, you can always contact us or find our social media. We're at Maximum Velocity Physical Therapy, or MVPT. And in regards to the cycling components, we offer bike fits, so we can really hone you in on your fit on the tri-bike.
It's a medical bike fit.
That's right. And what that means is that we don't just fit you to a number like a lot of other bike fits do. We take into account, your range of motion, your strength, your mobility, and your overall injury history, because all of those are going to play a role in how you fit on your bike. It's not just about getting you as low as possible. And then we also offer what we call ride-alongs. So ride-alongs are basically if you're just, something feels off when you're riding outside. You don't really know how to climb out of the saddle. You don't really know when to push. You feel like something is just weird. And what we do is that we'll ride with you. We'll go out and straight up ride with you, and we'll watch you. We'll see and we'll analyze how you're pedaling, how you're moving, because all of this is very much different than how you are in the trainer, inside.
Facts.
And lastly, we're PTs. So we do rehab for your injuries, but also I think what sets us apart is that injury prevention. So we want to treat you as the clinicians we wish we had when we were athletes, which means that, I want to be better, but I don't want these injuries to come back. And, it's probably not the best business model, but it kind of is too. Because I love seeing, we love seeing our athletes not just get better, but perform great things. And they're not going to do that if they're just coming back every couple of months because that same injury comes back. So it just doesn't make sense for us as sports PTs.
Totally. We always do this, Derrick. What are you listening to?
Ooh. I am kind of going through nostalgia, so I'm back on Good Charlotte. Shout out to Good Charlotte.
Wait, what? Good Charlotte? Nostalgic about Good Charlotte?
Yeah, I grew up with it like when I was in middle school. And then I'm going through my CDs because my car's a CD
Middle
player.
School? Oh my God.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Middle school.
I turned 27.
Good Lord, he's a baby.
And I wish I had a Young and Hopeless album. I just wish I had that because it's my favorite album from them.
Oh, gotcha. Do they have a pressing of that?
I don't know.
Ah.
I have to check, but I'm scouting out my Goodwills right now, looking for that CD. So
oh wow!
If anyone finds it, let me know. What's that?
You want a CD?
Yeah, I want the CD.
Oh, not the album.
Yeah, no, I want the CD.
Gotcha. Because I have an album collection.
And what are you listening to, Ron?
So my girlfriend's daughter is head over heels in love with Cage the Elephant.
Okay.
And I'm super stoked about being able to share music with her.
Yeah.
And so we've been listening to a lot of Cage the Elephant.
It's awesome.
Yeah, super cool. So in the clinic, we have Cage the Elephant radio happening a lot. That's really why, because Alexis is all fired up about it.
Pretty cool.
Pretty cool.
Shout out to Alexis.
Word. Without further ado, that's all for today. Today we talked about the factors influencing the best run split off the bike and how the metrics of your bike influence your run. Thanks, Derrick, for dropping some knowledge today. Looking forward to more bike stuff in the future. And with that being said, let's see that scratch. Roar. That's all for today.